It started with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come gently, but creeps in like a fog that suffocates everything warm, everything kind, everything once worth holding on to, and it came to live between Sophie and Daniel like a third presence in their cold house. A ghost that haunted the hallway, the bedroom, the untouched dinner table, and though neither of them said the word resentment, it hung in the air every time Daniel avoided her gaze or muttered an absent-minded yeah to things she never said, until Sophie began to feel like a placeholder in her own life, like a chair someone forgot to put away after a party. And the truth was, Daniel hadn't touched her in 9 months. Not since his big promotion, not since he came home with champagne and a smirk and kissed her like a stranger. And somewhere between the missed dates, the excuses, the new passwords on his phone, Sophie stopped asking questions, because she already knew the answer. Because the perfume on his collar wasn't hers, and the lipstick smudged on his shirt wasn't the color she wore, and the guilt wasn't even the worst part. It was the entitlement, the way he looked at her like she was lucky to be tolerated, like his success had elevated him to some untouchable place where fidelity was optional and love was just a contract signed out of convenience. And maybe she could have screamed or cried, but Sophie was not the pleading kind, never had been, not even as a girl. And so she swallowed her pride like poison and smiled through clenched teeth, because if he could pretend, so could she. And that's when Ethan came back to town. Daniel's younger brother, the so-called failure, the artist, the wanderer, the one their parents whispered about at Christmas and whose name Daniel only said with an eye roll. But Ethan had always looked at her differently, even back then, even before the wedding, like she wasn't just something to possess, but something to understand. And when she saw him again 5 years older, with that crooked grin and eyes that looked straight through her defenses, she felt something crack inside her, something she didn't even know was still alive. And it wasn't instant, it wasn't reckless, it was slow and careful and calculated, like a game of chess played in silence. And it started with small things. Coffee in the kitchen when Daniel was away, long walks at dusk with the excuse of needing air, text messages about movies that turned into confessions at 2 a.m. and one night after Daniel had flown out to Vegas for business, she sat beside Ethan on the couch, a glass of red wine in her hand, and she looked at him and asked, "Do you ever think we married the wrong people?" And the way he looked at her, like he'd been waiting years to hear that, was the moment she decided to stop being the victim and start being the one who writes the ending. And when she kissed him, it wasn't soft and shy, it was angry and hungry and loud with years of neglect and silent dinners. And Ethan didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate, because maybe he'd been waiting too, maybe he was just as broken. And that night in the house she shared with Daniel, in the bed Daniel hadn't touched in months, she let herself fall apart in someone else's arms and hated how good it felt, how right it felt, how easy it was to forget loyalty when loyalty had already died. And afterward, lying in the dark, wrapped in the warmth of betrayal, Sophie didn't cry, didn't whisper apologies to the ceiling, she just breathed, deep and full for the first time in what felt like years. And when Daniel came home 2 days later, smelling of whiskey and someone else's shampoo, she smiled at him like nothing had changed, because nothing had, not in the ways that mattered. And Ethan, bless him, kept her secret like a sacred vow. But it didn't stop there. It became a rhythm, a ritual, a slow-burning war waged in silk sheets. And Sophie became addicted not just to the sex but to the power, to the knowledge that she could still choose, still control something, still hurt back. And when Daniel finally noticed, when he started asking where she was going, why she looked different, why she was humming in the mornings, Sophie just laughed, because it was too late, because he had taught her how to lie with a straight face, how to weaponize silence, how to make love and hate look like the same thing. And one night just after New Year's, Daniel confronted her, not with fists or rage but with calm suspicion, and she met his gaze with a calm of her own, the kind of calm that comes from knowing the game is already won. And she said, "You want to know who it is?" And before he could speak she added, "You won't believe it," and watched his face crumble in slow motion as realization dawned, as the puzzle pieces clicked into place and the blood drained from his cheeks. Ethan had always been the one thing Daniel believed he was better than, the one failure he could look down on. And now that failure had stolen the one thing Daniel thought would never leave him. And in that moment Sophie didn't feel shame or regret. She felt reborn, like the pain had finally exited her body and entered his. And though things would never go back to the way they were, though the marriage would become a cold, cracked thing held together by appearances and shared property, she knew she'd never be powerless again. And as for Ethan, well, he disappeared a few months later, moved to another city, started fresh, sent her one letter she never answered. But Sophie didn't need him to stay, because the affair wasn't about love, It was about resurrection, about burning the old version of herself to the ground and walking through the ashes in heels. And from that day on, every time Daniel looked at her, he saw the scar she'd left on his pride, and that was enough, that was everything. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud or violent or poetic. It's quiet, and it wears red lipstick and a smile that says, I know exactly what I'm doing. But revenge, even when precise, even when justified, does not come without a cost. And in the weeks that followed, Sophie began to notice the tremors beneath the surface, small fractures in her own reflection that hadn't been there before. Because as much as she had wanted to be free of Daniel's indifference, she hadn't expected to become a stranger to herself, hadn't expected the weight of power to be so heavy when carried alone. And it wasn't guilt, not in the conventional sense. It was something more complex, something like grief for a version of herself that once believed in things like trust and forgiveness and second chances. And though she told herself she had no regrets, that she would do it all again without blinking, there were nights when she'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what it meant that she had found her voice through betrayal, that her liberation had come wrapped in another man's hands. And Daniel, for his part, didn't yell, didn't beg, didn't even leave. He simply shifted like a man who had seen behind the curtain and found nothing worth saving. And while he never said Ethan's name again, Sophie could feel his presence lingering in the air like a ghost neither of them could exorcise. And they continued the charade. Breakfast at the same table, bills paid on time, polite smiles at parties. But their marriage had become a frozen lake, silent, beautiful, and deadly beneath the surface. And Sophie realized she was no longer angry at Daniel but at the years she had given him, the loyalty she had wasted like watering a dead garden. And as spring came and the days lengthened, she found herself wandering more, not to find Ethan, not to replace him, but to hear herself think, to listen to the quiet voice inside her that was no longer fueled by spite but by something deeper, something almost peaceful. And it was during one of those walks through the city park, when the cherry blossoms had just begun to fall like confetti, that she met Claire, a stranger on a bench with a novel in her lap and a kindness in her eyes that made Sophie sit down without thinking. And what started as idle conversation, books, travel, art, turned into a ritual of its own. Two women meeting on Thursdays to share thoughts unspoken in their homes. And Claire didn't pry, didn't judge, just listened. And Sophie, for the first time in years, spoke not to manipulate, not to wound, but to simply be heard. And through those quiet exchanges she began to reconstruct herself not as someone's wife, not as someone's betrayal, but as someone with a story of her own. And when Daniel finally asked for a divorce, 3 months later, calmly, over dinner like a business negotiation, Sophie nodded and said, yes, without tears, without drama. Just a quiet acknowledgement that they had both already left long ago, and the papers were signed without ceremony, and Daniel moved into a penthouse across town, sleek and cold and everything he had always wanted. And Sophie stayed in the house, not out of sentiment but out of rebellion, because she had earned every corner of it, every floorboard that had once carried her grief. And she repainted the walls, changed the locks, threw out the mattress they had shared. When the divorce became public, people gossiped. Of course they did. But no one knew the truth, not really, and Sophie didn't offer explanations because power, she had learned, isn't in revenge or rage. It's in silence, in restraint, in the refusal to be defined by your worst moment. And Claire, still faithfully on that bench every Thursday, began to see more of Sophie, not just her pain but her wit, her ambition. And there was no grand love story there, not yet, maybe not ever. But there was intimacy, honesty, a gentle hand on the back when the memories crept in like smoke. And Sophie realized she didn't need to be forgiven, she only needed to forgive herself. And so she did, not all at once, not with fanfare, but slowly, in the way a wound closes without you noticing. And though Ethan never returned, though he remained a ghost she sometimes visited in memory, she no longer felt shame or longing, only gratitude for the role he played in her awakening. Because the affair hadn't been about him, not really, it had been a mirror, a moment, a catalyst, and now she was someone new, someone whole. And as summer unfolded and the air grew thick with heat and possibility, Sophie stood barefoot in her kitchen one evening, a glass of wine in hand, music playing softly, and she looked around at the space she had reclaimed, not just the house but her body, her choices, her name. And she smiled, not because everything had healed, but because she was no longer hiding, no longer waiting, no longer shrinking to fit inside someone else's story. And in that smile there was no revenge, only rebirth.